Looking at Habermas's critique of Klein's conception of argumentation, and we had stopped here at Klein's empiricist truncation. Empiricist is, as we will see, is Habermas uses it in a specific sense of his own, and it would have to be understood in the context in which he is talking about. So Klein's empiricist truncation of the space of argumentation can be seen in how he uses the concept of collective the concept of collectively valid. So we had covered this last time, the quotation from Klein, which Habermas is discussing, and then Habermas's initial comments on it. So if you don't remember, you can go back, but just to keep the continuity, I will just reread this part so we can have some sense of what happened last time. Okay. Toulmin's schema is a certain, this is Klein's, a passage from Klein. Toulmin's schema is a certain respect much closer to actual argumentation than the formal approaches he criticized, but it is a schema of correct argumentation. So he's not just interested in describing actual argumentation, but sort of by looking at actual argumentation also come at a correct a criterion for deciding what is correct and incorrect argument within actual argumentation. He has not set up an empirical investigation into how people actually do argue. So even though Toulmin's work is important in diverting attention to the actual argumentation, it's still not what Klein's want to do, is to see how people actually argue. So the practice of argument. So Klein is important. Wolfgang Klein is interested in actual argument, the practice of argumentation, how people actually argue. And I guess in that actual argumentation, you can also see how people consider certain arguments as correct argument and certain other argument as incorrect argument. So there would be criterion as well, but that criteria are the criterias gleaned from the actual practice of the people who actually involve in argumentation. This is true of Perelman et al. As well, though of all the philosophical approaches, they come closest to real argumentation. Okay, but the auditoire universal, one of their central concept, that is universal audience, that's the concept of Perelman, etc., is certainly not a group of actually existing people. So that's criticism of Perelman, etc. So Klein appreciates Toulmin's work for diverting attention to the actual practice of argumentation, but he criticizes it for not going far enough. And then he said that Perelman and his colleagues, they have come closer to real argumentation, closer than Toulmin, I guess. But their work is still is not, it doesn't hit the mark because they introduce concepts which are not, or criterion which are not gleaned from the actual practice, but sort of imposed on the actual practice. So, but the order to universal, one of the central concepts is certainly not a group of actually existing people. For instance, the Earth's present population. It is some quote or other, not easy to pin down in other respect. So this is a quote where you judge the actual argumentation, but this quote is not the actual argumentation itself, but some sort of idealized form or idealized criterion derived from or imposed on the actual argumentation. And as we will see, Habermas actually will come close to this Perelman in this respect. Perelman et al.'s view. So Klein's possible objection on Habermas's concept would be the same. And that's why, as we will see, Habermas is criticizing or will criticize Klein for being too much empiricist. So Habermas will not contest his intention or his project of actually paying attention to the actual argumentation, but he will contest his objection to any form of idealization. That's what he calls empiricist truncation. I'm not concerned with the rational. Sorry. So this is Klein. I'm not concerned with what rational, reasonable, or correct argumentation is, but how people, dumb as they are, actually argue. On the other hand, as you will see, Habermas, like other people discussed in here, Toulmin and Perelman and other people, he is interested in reasonable or correct argumentation. And he, as against Klein, he thinks that correct argumentation cannot be derived from empiricist or actual argumentation. We have to go beyond to some sort of a criterion in order to judge the actual practices. Otherwise, we will succumb to what he called empiricist truncation. And empiricism in this sense is a sort of a negative term for Habermas, because even though he doesn't deny him paying attention to the actual argument, he does reject, like Kant, for example, reject Humean empiricism on the ground that you can't reduce all experience to empiricism, empiricist analysis. As simply Habermas would say that, also Habermas would say that you can't, it's important to look at the actual argumentation, how people actually argue, but you can't reduce all criteria to differentiate between what is correct and incorrect argumentation. You can't drive that from the actual practices as such, or can't reduce to the actual practices as such. Okay, so I want to show, and now this is Habermas, I want to show how Klein, in his attempt to adopt an external perspective is also Habermas's pet term. External perspective for him is the perspective of an observer, and not as against the perspective of a participant. So it's possible that you attempt both um, perspectives at the same time. So, for example, you are a participant in the practice of argumentation, but you also, from time to time, take a step backward and become an observer. So that would be an external perspective for him. So I want to show how Klein in his attempt, an external perspective for Habermas is closely related to empiricism, and that's one of his criticism of empiricism, that empiricism only has this external perspective. It cannot have an access to internal perspective. Which is a bit strange because on the one hand you are saying that we shouldn't drive the actual criterion from the actual practices alone, but on the other hand you're also saying that we shouldn't rely on external perspective alone. Anyway, so I want to show how Klein, in his attempt to adopt an external perspective in order to separate clearly de facto from valid. Gets involved in instructive contradiction. So Klein for Habermas. Okay, let's look at this a bit closely. Now, Klein wants to look at actual practices of argumentation. Habermas is fine with that. Habermas wants to do that too. But Habermas doesn't want to reduce all the argumentation to the actual practice. Argumentation. Why? Because he would say that actual practices can be looked at from two perspectives. External perspective and internal or perspective. Internal, we mean perspective of the participants. Participants in the argumentation. What Habermas would say that Klein limit himself to external perspective alone, that the perspective of an observer who is observing what people are doing. But what Habermas is saying, that observer would miss out a lot of things which can only be accessed from internal perspective. Internal perspective of participants who are raising and defending claims. And this perspective we call empiricist truncation. It's a truncation because it leaves out the internal perspective from Habermas's viewpoint. Okay. So I want to show how Klein, in his attempt to adopt an external perspective in order to separate clearly de facto from valid argumentation, gets involved in instructive contradiction. But Habermas's point of view would be that you can't make this distinction between de facto from valid from the point of view of an external perspective. To make the distinction between de facto and valid, you would have to adopt the perspective of the participant in an argumentation, because only from the first person perspective of a participant within actual argumentation, Habermas would claim, you can even get the sense of this difference between, or this distinction between, de facto and valid. We'll see. Obviously, we would have to look at Habermas's argument in detail, but just to give a pointer to what sort of to the basic insight of Habermas in this respect, let us pause a minute. Let us pause a minute on and reflect on this point. So what's this? So external perspective for Habermas is the perspective of an observer who is not a participant in the argumentation, but who is looking at what people are doing at their practice, how they are arguing, their actual argumentation. And this is an empiricist perspective as well. And for Habermas, this is an important part of our description of reality. But our description of reality cannot be reduced to this perspective alone, because there's another perspective which opens another world to us, that is the perspective of a participant. In an actual argumentation. So this perspective include this is the internal perspective. This internal perspective has a first person perspective, but also the intersubjective perspective. So just to go back to why Habermas is claiming de facto from valid. Or fact of giving reason. From where the reason are valid or invalid. So this whole thing about validity doesn't get even introduced. So reason as a fact is just a validity claim. And this claim is just a fact from the external perspective. But it gets the force of validity only from an internal perspective, because when as a participant I give a reason, as a valid reason for something I have claimed within an argumentation, as a participant within this activity of argumentation or communicative argumentation, I get bound by, just in the very act of claiming something as a reason for my claim, to defend these reasons against the possible or actual objection of other participants in that argumentation and communication. And this accrues a binding force, this very act of giving a reason for my claim within the practice of argumentation. This binding force which accrues in the very act of claiming my claim. And then given reason for this claim when asked. This very act accrues a binding force which binds me to defend my reason against the possible objections of other participants. This binding force cannot be felt by the observer, according to Habermas. And this binding force, according to Habermas, is not a subjective force. This binding force is the force imposed on the participants by the very structure of the participation and communication and argumentation. And this binding force imposed by that structure, in combination with internal and intersubjective perspective, imposes this binding force and provides sort of a self transcendence from within, which is not available to an observer. An observer wouldn't feel that force of that binding force, which I, as the participant in the communication and the one who has raised this claim, will feel. And that would be Habermas's line of criticism against Klein, that the very distinction between de facto, because there's a same reason which is a de facto claim, same reason is the valid claim. It's a de facto claim from an external perspective, a valid claim from an internal perspective. So if you are looking at from external perspective, you won't feel that distinction. You can't make that distinction. In order to make that distinction, you have to jump into the actual or supposed argumentation and its dynamic, which include internal perspective, intersubjective perspective, and the structure of argumentation, along with external perspective. Okay, so I want to show how Klein, in his attempt to adopt an external perspective in order to separate clearly de facto from valid argumentation, gets involved in instructive contradiction. So we actually end up doing some more reflection on what we had already covered last time, and we haven't even finished that part, so that's fine. There's no rush. The main thing is to understand the issues, not and the text is just to help us. Okay, thank you. So we will continue this in the next session.